Today we're looking at Ephesians chapter 2, beginning in verse 11 on through the end of the chapter. Please pause your video and read that portion now. As we look at this portion, we remember the context previously. We remember in chapter 1 how God had predestined a select few so that they could take this message of good news to all who would hear and believe and be accepted into this grace, this relationship with Christ. And into chapter 2, we see that grace defined, how that grace can be attained. That is a free gift of God, that our salvation comes not by works so that no one can boast, but it's a gift of God given to all who would receive. And then out of that, we are God's workmanship created in Christ Jesus to do good works, which he prepared in advance. So out of that receiving of grace, we also do good works and live it out. As we get into verse 11 of chapter 2, we see Paul making this contrast between the circumcision and the uncircumcision. That the reminder is this covenant going back to the Old Testament, back to Abraham, and then passed on through Isaac and Jacob. The covenant that God made, there is a narrow sense to it, where it was given to Abraham, then Isaac, then Jacob, and their descendants. However, there was a broad sense to it as well. It was something that would impact the whole world, that God said that the whole world would be blessed through their offspring. Here, as we get into Ephesians chapter 2, Paul is writing to a primarily Gentile audience. And he's talking about them in this as the uncircumcision. That's the name given to them from the Jewish people who remembered the covenant with Abraham. That idea that circumcision was the mark of that covenant. So the Jewish people, as a covenant people, as a people chosen by God, in time it became a point of arrogance for some, that they were the chosen people, so the others were the others. They were outside of God's covenant. They were outside of this relationship with God. And the Jewish people had more direct access to God in their perspective. So Paul talks about them as those who were once far off, those who were once distant. But the beauty of this grace in Jesus Christ is that Paul talks about now they are no longer distant. Now they are being brought together as one in this new covenant that God has made through Jesus. That whoever would receive this grace would be included in this new covenant. And they are being built together as one to live out this relationship with God. And we see that it was through the cross that this was made possible. And now in verse 18, this beautiful verse that says, "For through him we both have access to the Father by one Spirit." That no longer is it a distinction between Jew and Gentile, but now all have access to God the Father through the Spirit because of what Jesus had done on the cross. That this access to God is available to any and all who would receive that. Those who are the Gentiles are no longer foreigners or aliens, Paul says in verse 19, but fellow citizens with God's people. Paul called for an equality here, that there's no longer this distinction between Jew and Gentile. And we see as we get later into this book, this letter to the Ephesians, that this call to equality goes beyond just Jew and Gentile, but it's a call to equality for all who are in Christ Jesus. And I love verse 22 as well. "And in him you two are being built together to become a dwelling in which God lives by his Spirit." This profound mystery, God's Spirit in us, no longer distant from God, but now we have access to God the Father through the Spirit and through the cross. And God's Spirit is working in us in this profound sort of way that's hard to wrap our minds around and describe. But we'll look into this as we continue on in the book of Ephesians.